Deep in the Arkansas Ozarks of 1892, where morning mist clings to mountain peaks like secrets refusing to surface, stood Beacon Ridge, a place so remote that screams would echo into empty wilderness. The story I'm about to tell began in this forgotten corner of America, where two young sisters lived under the watchful eye of a trusted spiritual guardian, completely isolated from any male contact for 7 long years. Yet within months of each other, both women delivered healthy babies. The community whispered of miracles, but what federal investigators discovered hidden in that mountain compound revealed a truth far more sinister than divine intervention. How could the impossible happen twice? What drove a respected man of God to such unthinkable deception? And what evidence finally broke years of enforced silence? What you're about to discover will test everything you believe about trust and betrayal. Subscribe to stand with us in exposing these buried truths and comment your city and time. We're amazed where these documented accounts reach. The morning of March 15, 1893, midwife Esther Crowley descended the treacherous mountain path from Beacon Ridge with trembling hands clutched around her leather birthing satchel. Behind her, wisps of smoke still rose from the isolated compound where she had just delivered a healthy baby boy to 19-year-old Charity Hensley. What should have been a moment of joy had instead filled Crowley with a creeping dread that made her quicken her pace down the rocky trail. For 7 years, Brother Matthias Cordwainer had proclaimed the Hensley sisters as pure vessels, untouched by any man, protected in their sacred virginity for divine purpose. Yet Crowley had just delivered clear evidence that someone had been lying. By noon, word had spread through the scattered cabins and trading posts of Crow's Hollow like wildfire through dry timber. The impossible had happened on the mountain. Charity Hensley, the eldest sister who hadn't been seen by most community members for over 3 years, had borne a child despite living in complete isolation from male contact under Brother Cordwainer's spiritual guardianship. Sheriff Augustus McMullen recorded in his daily log that no fewer than 12 citizens approached him with questions and concerns about the miraculous birth, their voices carrying a mixture of wonder and unease that he couldn't quite dismiss. Brother Cordwainer appeared in town that very afternoon, his imposing 6-foot frame cutting through the gathering crowd outside Fletcher's General Store with the confidence of a man blessed by divine favor. His deep voice boomed across the wooden boardwalk as he proclaimed God's miracle, describing how the Almighty had chosen Charity as a vessel for pure conception, untainted by earthly desires. The gathered mountain folk listened with the reverence they had shown for 8 years, but Tobias Fletcher noticed something in their eyes that hadn't been there before, doubt creeping in like shadows at sunset. Fletcher's detailed merchant ledgers, later subpoenaed as evidence, showed that Cordwainer had been purchasing increasing amounts of women's supplies and baby items over the past 6 months, requests that now took on sinister implications. Dr. Hiram Welch arrived at his modest clinic 3 days later to find Esther Crowley waiting on his doorstep, her weathered face etched with lines of moral conflict that spoke louder than words. The midwife's hand shook as she pulled a folded paper from her apron, detailed notes she had taken during Charity's delivery, observations that contradicted everything Brother Cordwainer claimed about divine intervention. Welch's medical training at Rush Medical College had taught him to recognize the physical signs of sexual trauma, and Crowley's careful documentation described evidence no miraculous conception could explain. When she spoke in hushed tones about the young woman's condition and the fear she had seen in Charity's eyes, Welch knew he was looking at something far more earthly and infinitely more evil. The doctor's examination of Crowley's notes revealed disturbing details that transformed whispered community doubts into documented medical evidence. Crowley had recorded physical indicators of repeated sexual relations spanning months or possibly years, observations that directly contradicted Cordwainer's claims of preserved virginity. Her midwife's journal, written in careful script despite her limited formal education, detailed the young mother's obvious familiarity with physical intimacy and her frightened submission during the birth process. Most damning of all, Crowley had noted ligature marks on Charity's wrists and ankles, faded but still visible evidence of restraint that suggested something far more sinister than willing participation in any divine plan. Dr. Welch spent that evening reviewing his medical texts on assault examination, preparing documentation that would later prove crucial to federal investigators. His notes, preserved in Arkansas Territory court records, methodically outlined the physical evidence that made Cordwainer's miracle claims not just improbable, but medically impossible for a truly virginal woman. The doctor's careful medical language masked the horrifying reality of sustained sexual abuse, but his clinical observations provided the scientific foundation that would eventually bring justice to Beacon Ridge. By lamplight, Welch drafted a formal report that would become Exhibit A in the prosecution's evidence file, each medical term representing another nail in Brother Cordwainer's eventual coffin. Meanwhile, on Beacon Ridge, 17-year-old Temperance Hensley was beginning to show the early signs of her own impossible condition. Cordwainer's journal entries, discovered months later during the federal investigation, revealed his calculating observation of the younger sister's pregnancy symptoms and his plans to claim another divine miracle. The self-proclaimed shepherd's detailed notes described his manipulation of both sisters' understanding of their own bodies, keeping them ignorant of biological realities while positioning himself as their only interpreter of God's will. His writings revealed a methodical approach to psychological control that had taken years to perfect, each entry demonstrating the premeditated nature of crimes that would eventually send him to Arkansas State Prison. Word of Temperance's condition reached Sheriff McMullen through his wife, who had heard whispers from women trading at Fletcher's store about the younger sister's expanding waistline visible during her rare appearances in the compound's vegetable garden. McMullen's incident reports, later entered as evidence in federal court, documented his growing unease about the situation on Beacon Ridge, and his internal conflict between respecting religious authority and protecting vulnerable community members. The sheriff had received 3 separate complaints about the sisters' isolation over the past 2 years, concerns he had dismissed as interference in legitimate religious practice, but now viewed with mounting alarm. Reverend Samuel Hartwell, the legitimate Methodist circuit preacher who served the mountain communities, arrived for his monthly visit to find the entire region buzzing with talk of miracles and mounting suspicions. His theological education immediately identified the heretical nature of Cordwainer's teachings, particularly the self-proclaimed prophet's claims about divine conception and his exclusive access to spiritual truth. Hartwell's detailed letter to his Methodist superiors, preserved in denominational archives, described the growing evidence of systematic abuse disguised as religious practice and requested immediate intervention from territorial authorities. The Reverend's moral authority carried significant weight with mountain folk who had begun questioning everything they thought they knew about their trusted spiritual shepherd. The breaking point came when Dr. Welch received permission from Esther Crowley to share her detailed birthing notes with Sheriff McMullen, creating the first official documentation linking medical evidence to criminal suspicion. McMullen's report to territorial authorities described a pattern of isolation, control, and now physical evidence suggesting serious crimes against vulnerable women under the guise of religious protection. The sheriff's careful documentation would later provide the foundation for federal jurisdiction, as crimes crossing religious boundaries and involving potential kidnapping fell under territorial rather than local authority. Within 48 hours of McMullen's report reaching Little Rock, Deputy Marshal Jeremiah Blackwood received orders to investigate the situation on Beacon Ridge, carrying with him the authority to pursue evidence wherever it might lead. The stage was now set for a confrontation between earthly justice and claimed divine authority, with mounting evidence suggesting that Brother Cordwainer's mountain sanctuary had become something far more sinister than a place of worship. Deputy Marshal Jeremiah Blackwood arrived in Crow's Hollow on June 7, 1893, carrying federal warrants and a leather satchel containing Dr. Welch's damning medical reports. His weathered cavalry boots kicked up dust clouds as he approached Sheriff McMullen's modest office. But the real storm was brewing in his methodical investigator's mind that had learned to piece together evidence like a battlefield surgeon reconstructing shattered bones. McMullen's preliminary files revealed a pattern of systematic isolation that transformed what should have been a religious sanctuary into something resembling a frontier prison, complete with controlled access and monitored communication. Blackwood's first notation in his official logbook identified 17 separate violations of territorial law regarding the confinement of vulnerable persons, violations that carried sentences ranging from 5 years to life imprisonment. The federal marshal's initial approach to Beacon Ridge revealed architectural anomalies that immediately triggered his military-trained suspicious. The compound consisted of 4 buildings arranged in a defensive square, with clear sightlines between structures and only one visible entrance through a heavy wooden gate that stood permanently locked from the inside. Blackwood's sketched survey, later entered as Prosecution Exhibit 12, documented gun ports carved into the main cabin's walls and storage buildings positioned to prevent any unseen approach to the sisters' quarters. Most disturbing of all, his trained eye identified deliberate design elements intended not to keep intruders out, but to keep inhabitants confined within the compound's wooden walls. Brother Cordwainer emerged from the main cabin with the practiced authority of a man accustomed to absolute control over his domain, his imposing frame filling the doorway as he demanded to see Blackwood's credentials and divine authority for disturbing God's work. The federal marshal's official report described Cordwainer's immediate attempts to establish dominance through religious rhetoric and physical intimidation, tactics that might have worked with local mountain folk but fell flat against a man trained in interrogating Confederate prisoners and dealing with frontier violence. Blackwood's calm presentation of federal warrants and territorial authority visibly shook Cordwainer's confidence, particularly when the marshal cited specific statutes regarding the unlawful confinement of minors and systematic interference with federal mail delivery. The compound supply delivery system revealed the first concrete evidence of systematic imprisonment that would later convince a federal jury of Cordwainer's crimes. Fletcher's subpoenaed delivery records showed that for over 3 years, all supplies had been deposited at the compound's outer gate with payment left in a locked wooden box, preventing any direct contact between the sisters and the outside world. Blackwood's investigation notes documented that even medical supplies requested during the sisters' pregnancies had been delivered through this isolation protocol, ensuring that no witness could observe the women's conditions or speak with them directly. The marshal's itemized list of delivered goods revealed disturbing patterns of restraint materials, medical supplies consistent with treating injuries, and increasing quantities of women's clothing in progressively larger sizes that tracked with both pregnancies. When Blackwood demanded to interview the sisters directly, Cordwainer's response revealed the psychological control mechanisms that had maintained his power for nearly a decade. The self-proclaimed prophet claimed the women were in spiritual retreat and could not be disturbed by worldly authorities, but his nervous gestures and repeated glances toward their quarters suggested something far more calculated than religious observance. Federal law regarding the questioning of potential victims gave Blackwood the authority to override religious objections, particularly when armed with Dr. Welch's medical evidence and Sheriff McMullen's documented concerns about unlawful confinement. Cordwainer's desperate attempts to delay the interviews while claiming divine protection for his charges only strengthened the marshal's conviction that the compound's secrets ran deeper than miraculous pregnancies. The sisters' quarters revealed living conditions that shocked even a veteran investigator accustomed to frontier hardships and wartime deprivation. Blackwood's detailed inventory described a single room containing 2 narrow beds, basic cooking facilities, and barred windows that opened onto the compound's interior courtyard rather than the surrounding mountain wilderness. Most telling were the heavy wooden shutters that could only be secured from the outside, transforming the sisters' supposed sanctuary into an effective prison cell. The marshal's evidence photographs, among the first crime scene documentation in Arkansas Territory history, captured details that words alone could not convey. Scratches around the doorframe suggesting attempts to force entry or escape. Worn spots on the wooden floor indicating pacing patterns consistent with psychological distress, and personal belongings arranged with the obsessive neatness of people with too much time and too few possessions. The breakthrough in Blackwood's investigation came when his methodical examination of the compound's foundation revealed architectural inconsistencies that suggested hidden passages between buildings. His military engineering experience, gained during cavalry campaigns that required rapid construction and concealment, immediately identified structural elements that served no visible purpose in the compound's official design. The marshal's carefully drawn architectural survey documented supporting beams that extended beneath the sisters' quarters toward the main cabin, foundation stones arranged to create deliberate gaps for movement, and ventilation systems that connected separate buildings in ways that violated basic principles of frontier construction. Excavation of the suspected tunnel system required careful documentation to ensure admissibility in federal court, but the evidence it revealed would ultimately seal Cordwainer's fate. Blackwood's investigation uncovered a sophisticated network of underground passages connecting every building in the compound, with the primary tunnel running directly from Cordwainer's private chambers to a concealed entrance beneath the sisters' sleeping area. The marshal's measurements and photographs documented a construction project that must have taken months to complete, representing premeditated planning that contradicted any claims of spontaneous religious inspiration. Most damning of all, the tunnel walls bore clear evidence of recent use, including fabric scraps that matched clothing worn by both sisters and footprint impressions preserved in the earthen floor. The psychological impact of discovering the hidden passages finally began cracking the sisters' years of imposed silence, but their initial responses revealed the depth of Cordwainer's mental conditioning. When confronted with physical evidence of the tunnel system, both women initially claimed ignorance about their existence, their voices carrying the flat affect of people who had learned that survival depended on denying observable reality. Blackwood's patient interviewing techniques, developed through military intelligence work, gradually revealed that the sisters had been taught to view the tunnels as part of God's mysterious ways, spiritual pathways that only Brother Cordwainer could understand or explain. Their conditioned responses demonstrated sophisticated psychological manipulation that had convinced intelligent young women to accept the impossible as divine truth. Physical evidence found within the tunnel system provided the federal case with concrete proof of systematic sexual assault that no amount of religious rhetoric could explain away. Blackwood's careful collection of material evidence included personal items belonging to both sisters found in Cordwainer's private chambers, blood-stained fabric consistent with injuries sustained during violent assault, and restraint devices constructed from leather and rope that showed clear signs of regular use. The marshal's detailed evidence catalog, preserved in federal archives, documented over 30 separate items that told a story of calculated abuse disguised as religious practice. Each piece of evidence represented another crack in Cordwainer's facade of spiritual authority, and another step toward the justice that would ultimately be served in federal court. The compound's systematic isolation became fully apparent when Blackwood's investigation revealed that Cordwainer had intercepted all mail intended for the sisters, and had prevented them from sending any messages to the outside world for over 4 years. Federal postal regulations made interference with mail delivery a serious crime, but the Marshal's discovery of hidden correspondence revealed something far more sinister than simple isolation. Letters from distant relatives inquiring about the sisters' welfare had been systematically destroyed, while Cordwainer had forged responses claiming the women were thriving in their spiritual retreat and wished to remain undisturbed. The evidence of fraudulent correspondence provided additional federal charges while demonstrating the calculated nature of crimes that extended far beyond physical abuse into systematic psychological imprisonment. Deputy Marshal Blackwood's search warrant for Cordwainer's private quarters on July 23, 1893, uncovered what would become the most damning evidence in Arkansas Territory's criminal history. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in the self-proclaimed prophet's bedroom, wrapped in oiled leather to protect against mountain moisture, lay a leather-bound journal containing over 200 pages of meticulous handwritten documentation spanning 8 years of calculated abuse. The Marshal's trembling hands as he opened the journal's cover revealed not random religious musings, but systematically recorded entries detailing every aspect of Cordwainer's crimes, written in the careful script of a man who believed his actions served divine purpose. Each page represented another piece of evidence that would ultimately send the false prophet to his death in Arkansas State Prison. The journal's opening entries, dated from 1885 when the sisters first arrived at Beacon Ridge, revealed Cordwainer's methodical planning for what he termed his sacred mission to establish God's pure bloodline on earth. His early observations documented 12-year-old Charity's physical development with disturbing clinical detail, noting her potential for bearing children and her protective instincts toward her younger sister. The twisted theology recorded in precise handwriting described Cordwainer's belief that God had chosen him to father a generation of spiritually pure children through selected virgin vessels, justifying systematic rape as divine commandment rather than criminal assault. Federal prosecutors would later use these early entries to demonstrate premeditated sexual abuse of minors, charges that carried mandatory life sentences under territorial law. Cordwainer's journal entries from 1886 through 1888 documented the systematic grooming process he employed to condition both sisters for sexual abuse while maintaining their belief in his spiritual authority. His careful records described psychological manipulation techniques, including isolation from all outside influences, creation of dependency through controlled food distribution, and the gradual introduction of physical contact disguised as religious ritual. The false prophet's detailed notes revealed his study of the sisters' individual vulnerabilities, with particular attention to exploiting Charity's protective instincts and Temperance's natural submissiveness to adult authority. Each journal entry demonstrated calculated psychological warfare designed to break down natural resistance while maintaining the victim's cooperation through manufactured religious devotion. The journal's most horrifying sections contained detailed accounts of sexual assaults beginning when Charity reached age 15 and Temperance turned 13, written in clinical language that revealed Cordwainer's complete dehumanization of his victims. His records describe the physical and psychological methods he used to overcome resistance, including restraint techniques, threats against the younger sister's safety, and elaborate theological justifications for violent sexual acts. The false prophet's meticulous documentation included dates, duration, and physical details of assaults spanning over 4 years, providing federal prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of systematic rape and sexual torture. Most disturbing of all, Cordwainer's entries revealed his belief that documenting these crimes proved his divine calling rather than his criminal guilt. Blackwood's continued search of Cordwainer's quarters revealed financial records that exposed another layer of systematic control and criminal conspiracy. Hidden ledgers documented the false prophet's manipulation of the sisters' inheritance from their deceased parents, including forged signatures on legal documents transferring property ownership to Cordwainer's religious organization. The Marshal's evidence inventory listed bank records showing systematic theft of funds intended for the sisters' care, money that Cordwainer had diverted to expand his compound and purchase materials for the tunnel system used to facilitate his crimes. Federal banking investigators would later determine that Cordwainer had stolen over $3,000 in inherited funds, a sum that represented significant wealth in the mountain economy of the 1890s. The discovery of medical supplies and crude surgical instruments in Cordwainer's private chambers provided disturbing evidence of the physical violence that accompanied his sexual assaults. Blackwood's detailed inventory documented blood-stained restraints, primitive medical tools consistent with treating injuries inflicted during violent attacks, and supplies suggesting forced medical procedures performed without proper training or sanitation. The Marshal's photographs of these materials, among the first crime scene evidence pictures in federal court history, captured proof of systematic torture that extended far beyond sexual assault into deliberate infliction of physical suffering. Dr. Welch's later examination of these instruments confirmed their use in causing the injuries documented during his medical examination of both sisters. Cordwainer's journal entries from 1891 and 1892 revealed his escalating excitement about the sisters' approaching fertile years and his detailed plans for claiming divine miracle status for their inevitable pregnancies. His careful calculations about menstrual cycles, optimal timing for sexual assault, and anticipated community reactions demonstrated the premeditated nature of crimes that he presented as spontaneous, divine intervention. The false prophet's writings described his manipulation of local religious sentiment to create acceptance for miraculous pregnancies while maintaining his own spiritual authority over skeptical community members. These entries provided prosecutors with clear evidence